It's one of the most quoted films in cinema history, yet almost nobody remembers it correctly. A Few Good Men feels bulletproof now, but behind the scenes it was fragile, debated, and carefully engineered just to survive. Studios feared the courtroom would bore audiences. The ending was nearly rewritten, and that famous line, "It was never meant to be the point." These aren't random trivia facts, they're decisions that quietly shaped everything you think you know about this movie. And the first one almost erased the film's entire identity. Number 1. The courtroom finale, nearly vanished. The sequence that defines this film almost didn't make it into the finished version. Studio executives were convinced that a long, dialogue-heavy courtroom climax would lose mainstream audiences, that the film would feel too much like a stage production, too static, too commercially dangerous for a wide theatrical release. Serious conversations were had about restructuring the third act entirely to sidestep what the studio saw as an unavoidable trap. Rob Reiner and the creative team refused to move. Their position was that the courtroom wasn't simply a setting for the story, it was the story's engine. Every character development, every thematic thread, every piece of accumulated tension had been constructed specifically to discharge in that room. Softening or removing it wouldn't produce a safer film, it would produce a hollow one. Holding the courtroom was a late and genuinely risky commitment, and it ended up defining everything the film became. Without it, there is no confrontation, no confession, no reason the film is still being watched and quoted more than 30 years later. The sequence the studio feared would bury the picture turned out to be the reason it survived. Number 2. Jessup was never meant to testify. In the earliest versions of the story, Colonel Jessup never entered a courtroom. The original design kept him distant, a figure whose authority operated through channels, through orders handed down, through the fear his name carried in every room he wasn't physically occupying. His power came precisely from his absence. He was meant to loom without ever arriving. The creative team eventually recognized that something essential was missing. The film needed escalation, a moment where the threat stopped being abstract and became immediate and physical. Putting Jessup on the stand changed the entire geometry of the story. Two men who had been operating at a remove were suddenly in the same room, and one of them was daring the other to push him. That structural decision transformed the film from a procedural inquiry into a direct confrontation. The courtroom stopped being a place where truth was assembled from evidence and became an arena where two opposing worldviews collided face to face. The villain was no longer protected by layers of institutional distance. He was right there, visible, and the film's tension found an entirely different pitch because of it. Number 3. That famous line was never the point. The line that became the film's cultural shorthand was written with a very different intention than the one audiences attached to it. "You can't handle the truth" wasn't designed as a moment of righteous exposure or a satisfying moral declaration. It was written to reveal something specific and disturbing about Colonel Jessup's psychology. His absolute, unshakable certainty that the civilians in that room are fundamentally incapable of understanding what it costs to keep them safe. The intended experience was discomfort, not triumph. The scene was built so audiences would sit with the unsettling recognition that Jessup means every word. He isn't performing arrogance for effect, he is expressing a worldview he considers not only correct but necessary and noble, and the film wanted viewers to feel the weight of that conviction rather than simply cheer at its exposure. What actually happened was that audience response collapsed the complexity into a catchphrase. The moment became a crowd pleaser, a quotable peak moment stripped of the ambiguity the writers had embedded in it. The line ended up on merchandise and in impression contests, and in cultural shorthand that bore almost no relationship to what it was originally doing. The deeper argument the film was making, that truth is genuinely hard, rarely clean, and never simply shouted into submission, got buried under applause. Number 4. Cruise was seen as too likable. Tom Cruise arrived on this project as one of the biggest stars in the world, and that status created problems the production hadn't anticipated. The concern among studio executives was that his natural screen presence, the ease, the charisma, the quality that made audiences trust him immediately, would undermine Daniel Kaffee from the start. A character who needed to be seen as evasive and avoidant couldn't work if the audience was already rooting for him unconditionally. The arc required that Kaffee feel genuinely compromised in the early sections of the film. He was supposed to read as someone squandering real ability, a talented lawyer who had arranged his career specifically to avoid anything that might actually test him. If Cruise's natural likability flattened that, the transformation wouldn't register when it finally came. because there would be nothing real to transform from. The role ended up serving Cruise's career in a way the studio's doubts hadn't anticipated. By working against his own most comfortable instincts on screen, by earning the audience's respect gradually, rather than claiming it immediately, he demonstrated a kind of dramatic range that his blockbuster roles hadn't required. It quietly reshaped what people believed he was capable of, and the doors it opened influenced the choices he made for years afterward. Number 5. The verdict almost went the other way. The clean resolution audience's experience at the end of the film wasn't the only version in development. Earlier drafts were willing to sit with something considerably messier, outcomes that refused to fully resolve, where the moral victory was murkier and the consequences remained genuinely unclear. Creatively, the ambiguity had real appeal because it reflected the film's uncomfortable subject matter more honestly than a decisive ending could. The argument for keeping things unresolved was substantive. Real justice is complicated, and a film that had spent its entire running time examining the limits of truth and the costs of challenging institutional power had something at stake in not tidying everything away. A cleaner ending risked contradicting, at the moment of resolution, what the story had been building toward. The final version was adjusted toward clarity and emotional satisfaction, landing more decisively than the darker drafts had intended. The moral weight is still present, but it settles rather than lingers. That choice produces catharsis where the earlier drafts had been willing to leave audiences unsettled, which changes what the film is ultimately saying. Not dramatically, but enough that the distinction is worth holding on to when considering what the film might have been. Number 6. The courtroom is mostly an illusion. The imposing space that audiences experience on screen was never fully built. Production designers constructed only the portions the camera actually needed, using partial sets, precise blocking, and deliberately chosen angles to produce the impression of a larger, more intimidating environment than the one that physically existed. The illusion was engineered shot by shot, and most viewers have spent 3 decades inside a room that was never really there. The approach wasn't purely a budget decision. Working with an incomplete space gave the filmmakers something a real courtroom couldn't have provided: total control over what the audience could see. By choosing sightlines with precision, by hiding the edges of the constructed environment, they could manage psychological pressure through composition, rather than simply document action as it occurred. The camera functioned as a tool for manufacturing tension, rather than a neutral observer of it. Every element served the words being spoken. The walls that didn't exist, the angles that deflected attention away from empty corners, the blocking that kept the frame tight on the faces that mattered. All of it was in service of dialogue that needed to land without any physical environment competing for attention. Audiences feel the room as a genuine weight without ever registering how much of it was strategically absent. Number 7. Military accuracy was selective. Military advisors were present throughout the production, shaping uniforms, terminology, and behavioral detail so that the film carried enough authenticity to earn the confidence of viewers familiar with that world. But the filmmakers never treated accuracy as an obligation that overrode storytelling. When the demands of military procedure conflicted with the demands of the narrative won, every time. The advisors contributed what the story could use and accepted that other details would be adjusted to serve clarity and pace. Certain procedures were simplified, certain ranks shifted, certain courtroom moments heightened beyond what an actual military tribunal would have produced. The goal was credibility, a world that felt real enough to sustain the drama, not documentation. Technical precision that slowed the story or confused the audience was never the target. What this selective approach produced was a film grounded in military culture without being trapped by it. Viewers who knew the world recognized enough to stay invested. Viewers who didn't know enough to follow without getting lost in procedural detail. Authenticity was deployed as a storytelling resource rather than imposed as a constraint, which is a distinction that separates competent filmmaking from pedantic filmmaking. Number 8. The Marines were told not to perform. Background performers playing Marines in the courtroom scenes received direction that reversed most actors' instincts: suppress everything. No personality, no individual reaction, no attempt to play the moment or contribute texture to the scene. The goal was rigid, expressionless presence, bodies that communicated institutional weight rather than human individuality. The reasoning was thematic rather than practical. The film is fundamentally about obedience, about what happens when people are trained to execute orders rather than evaluate them, and the background Marines were a living visual argument for that idea. Their stillness and uniformity made the courtroom feel like a space where conformity was the default state, where individuality had been systematically removed. They weren't decoration, they were evidence. The effect accumulates across the courtroom scenes in a way that operates below the level of conscious attention. Those motionless figures reinforce the culture being examined every time they appear in frame. By stripping performance from the background, the production ensured that every moment of individuality, every character who broke from the institutional mold to speak or act for themselves, registered as a genuine departure from the norm the film had been quietly establishing. Number 9. How the film sells authority. Visually, authority in this film is established through image long before it is addressed through words. The camera consistently grants certain characters space and stillness, framing them with a deference that communicates institutional weight before anyone has spoken a line about rank or power. Characters on the other side of that equation are shown in positions that emphasize their relative subordination. The visual grammar of the film has already told the audience who holds power and who challenges it before the dialogue confirms it. Costume details carry this language throughout. Medals, insignia, and the precise maintenance of uniforms communicate rank immediately and without explanation. Characters representing institutional authority are dressed with an immaculateness that signals control, while those questioning that authority often appear slightly less polished, more human, more fallible, more approachable. These choices aren't incidental. They constitute a visual argument that runs through the entire film. The effect is that by the time the verbal confrontation arrives, audiences already understand the power dynamics in the room through composition alone. The dialogue doesn't establish the hierarchy. It disrupts one that the images have already made clear. When the challenge finally comes, it reads as a genuine rupture rather than just another scene in a sequence, because the visual system has been so consistently maintaining the order that's about to be broken. Number 10. Demi Moore faced constant doubt. Demi Moore's casting generated skepticism that followed her through the entire production. Doubts about whether she could project the kind of courtroom authority the role required, whether audiences would accept her as a credible military lawyer standing alongside Tom Cruise, were neither quiet nor brief. They created sustained pressure on set that she had to absorb and work around while delivering a performance that didn't have room for anything other than precision. Her response was to strip the performance of anything that could be read as trying too hard. Where another actor might have pressed for theatrical moments to answer the doubts about their casting, Moore went in the opposite direction, toward restraint, competence, and a composure that didn't ask to be noticed. Her character earns authority through demonstrated capability rather than by announcing it, and every performance choice was calibrated toward gradual establishment rather than immediate assertion. That restraint is what gives the performance its durability. The character doesn't compete for attention, which paradoxically makes her feel essential to every scene she's in. The skepticism that surrounded the casting became completely invisible in the finished film, replaced by a performance that holds the courtroom together without ever drawing the spotlight onto itself. The doubts never found anything to attach to. Number 11. Jessup was played as a tragic figure. Jack Nicholson made a foundational decision about Colonel Jessup that changed everything the film could be. He refused to play the character as a villain who knows he's a villain. Instead, he found the man inside the antagonist, someone who genuinely believes he is the hero of his own story, carrying burdens that others lack the courage or the capacity to acknowledge. The anger in Jessup's performance doesn't come from malice. It comes from feeling profoundly unappreciated. This interpretation required Nicholson to locate authentic conviction in a man giving orders that lead to tragedy. Jessup, as Nicholson plays him, isn't cruel for the pleasure of it. He's a protector who has made a decision about what protection costs, and decided that decision was his alone to make. His contempt for the courtroom isn't arrogance performed for effect. It's the impatience of someone certain he is the only adult in the room. The result is that audiences can't dismiss him as simply wrong, because Nicholson won't allow that simplicity. The worldview Jessup expresses has internal coherence, and the performance makes that coherence felt, even while the story condemns its consequences. That is what elevates the confrontation beyond melodrama, not the spectacle of two actors performing at full intensity, but the genuine collision of two positions that each carry real weight. Number 12. The big confrontation was engineered. The climactic courtroom scene feels like two men losing control in real time, like something unplanned breaking through the surface of a formal proceeding. That quality of spontaneity was the product of meticulous construction. Every escalation, every interruption, every shift in who held the psychological advantage had been mapped and rehearsed. The explosion was choreographed to look like it couldn't have been choreographed. Pacing was the central engineering problem. The scene needed to build through controlled escalation without ever feeling controlled. Reaction shots were placed to create breathing space between verbal attacks, moments where the audience could register what had just happened before the next exchange arrived. Silence was deployed as deliberately as dialogue, calibrated to give weight to the seconds before the next blow landed. The physical dimension of the scene was equally planned. Movements were blocked to shift visual dominance as the scene progressed, with the camera tightening on specific faces at specific moments to reinforce the psychological transfers of power. What audiences experience as two performers discovering something together in the room was actually a precisely designed battle, one that required extensive preparation to produce the convincing impression that it required none at all. Number 13. Uniform details were obsessively policed. Wardrobe in this film functioned as a continuous argument about power. Every medal, every insignia, every crease was monitored through production to ensure that visual hierarchy remained legible and consistent in every frame. The wardrobe department worked alongside military advisors with the specific goal of making rank immediately readable through appearance, so that before anyone in the courtroom said a word, the audience could already see who commanded and who answered. The discipline extended beyond fabric and hardware. Actors were coached on posture, on how military personnel occupy physical space, on the specific way institutional training shapes a body's relationship to a room. The goal was creating human presences that communicated discipline before they spoke, figures who carried the weight of the system they represented in the way they stood and moved, not just in what they said. This layered visual control makes the film's moments of disruption land harder than they otherwise could. When the order the production has so carefully maintained finally breaks, when someone refuses to perform the required deference, it registers as a genuine rupture rather than a scripted moment, because the system being disrupted has been so consistently and precisely established. The precision makes the breakage meaningful. Number 14. Reiner fought to keep it talky. The pressure to open up the film and introduce more visual action was real and sustained. Studio executives wanted movement, spectacle, relief from the verbal intensity, something that would break the concentration of dialogue and reassure them that mainstream audiences wouldn't grow restless watching people talk in rooms. Rob Reiner faced a genuine push to make the film more conventionally cinematic in ways that would have fundamentally altered what it was. Reiner's counter-argument was that the dialogue was the action. The confrontations in this film carry more suspense than most chase sequences because the stakes are clearer, the characters more precisely drawn, and the outcomes less predictable. Trusting language to hold an audience without physical or visual relief was a real commercial gamble in an industry that equates excitement with kinetic energy. But Reiner held the position. The gamble worked, and the film stands as evidence for a proposition Hollywood periodically forgets: that properly constructed and performed dialogue generates more genuine tension than spectacle does. The restraint was an act of faith in the material and in the audience's willingness to follow wherever the words led. That faith was repaid in full, and the film's reputation rests partly on the fact that it refused to hedge that bet. Number 15. A stage hit had to be rebuilt. Aaron Sorkin's play had succeeded in the theater, and that success created a specific kind of problem for the adaptation. A stage triumph doesn't transfer. It demonstrates that the material works in one form, which says almost nothing about whether it will work in another. The rules of theatrical storytelling and cinematic storytelling are different enough that the adaptation required a ground-up reconstruction rather than a translation. Stage dialogue operates under different temporal rules. A live audience experiences a play as a continuous event, which accommodates longer speeches, different rhythms, and a pacing that films simply can't replicate. The editing process of cinema, the ability to cut between moments, to compress time, to move between locations, changes how long any single verbal exchange can hold an audience. Sorkin had to revisit language he'd already shaped to work beautifully and reshape it for a medium that would treat it differently. The reconstruction went deeper than dialogue into structure and visual logic. Scenes were reimagined for what cameras could capture that no stage could. The intimacy of a close-up during a crucial beat, the specific geography created by editing between faces, the rhythm that cuts established beneath and between lines. The play was the raw material, not the model. The film that emerged shared its DNA, but operated by completely different principles. Number 16. Kaffee isn't a hero at the start. The film begins with its protagonist in a condition audiences aren't invited to admire. Daniel Kaffee is introduced as a lawyer of genuine ability who has organized his entire career to avoid using that ability seriously. A plea bargain specialist who has refined the art of resolving cases efficiently enough that nothing ever actually demands anything of him. He's skilled and deliberately comfortable, and the film needs audiences to see the waste before they can appreciate the change. Tom Cruise had to work against what he naturally brings to any scene in order to make this opening portrait believable. Kaffee in the early sections of the film needed to feel like someone who had made a choice about what kind of person he was going to be, and that choice was the wrong one. If Cruise's screen presence made him immediately sympathetic and worth rooting for, the arc had nothing to move across. The transformation requires a genuine starting point. The film tracks the change through accumulation rather than announcement. Kaffee doesn't declare that he's becoming a better person or a braver one. He makes slightly different choices, under gradually increasing pressure, until he has crossed a line he had spent the entire film avoiding. By the time he stands in that courtroom in the film's final sequence, the shift feels completely earned, because audiences spent the preceding hour watching him resist making it. Number 17. Jessup is right about one thing. The film's moral architecture is more carefully constructed than a first viewing suggests. Colonel Jessup's worldview isn't simply wrong. It contains a genuine truth that the story acknowledges rather than dismisses, that protection has costs, that some people choose to bear those costs so others don't have to, and that demanding safety while refusing to confront what safety requires is its own kind of dishonesty. The film doesn't argue otherwise. What the story condemns is not military discipline or the necessity of hard decisions in genuinely dangerous situations. It condemns unchecked authority, the specific configuration in which power answers to no one, accepts no external accountability, and decides unilaterally what measures are justified. That's a much more precise target than a general critique of military culture, and the distinction matters to how the confrontation reads. Audiences often remember the film as a straightforward takedown of institutional arrogance, but the script is more careful than that. It holds two things simultaneously: that Jessup's methods were indefensible, and that Jessup's underlying concern was not simply invented or cynical. The ending produces real satisfaction, but the questions it raises don't dissolve with the verdict. That persistent discomfort, the sense that the film hasn't given you permission to stop thinking, is what makes it worth revisiting. Number 18. The code red wasn't the real crime. The specific incident at the center of the film, the code red that led to a Marine's death, functions as the surface of a much larger argument. The order that caused the tragedy wasn't an aberration within an otherwise healthy system. It was the predictable product of a culture built deliberately around the suppression of individual judgment in favor of institutional compliance. The film uses the specific case to indict the structure that made it possible. The two Marines who carried out the order are not portrayed as inherently cruel or even particularly thoughtless. They are portrayed as products of a specific kind of training engineered to remove hesitation and eliminate the gap between command and execution. The film asks whether that engineering, valuable as it may be in genuine combat situations, produces dangerous fragility when accountability is absent from the equation. The confession at the climax delivers the dramatic satisfaction audiences come for, but the deeper charge the film is making survives the verdict. Systems that demand obedience while removing the mechanisms that make obedience answerable to something beyond itself will produce tragedies that no individual confession can fully account for. The real crime in the film isn't what Jessup ordered. It's what made an order like that feel normal and defensible within the environment that produced it. Number 19. Silence does more than music. The film's most consequential moments arrive without a score. During the central confrontations, music disappears entirely. No orchestral swelling, no emotional cueing, no guidance about how the audience should be feeling. What remains is voices, pauses, and the weight of what's being said and not said. This wasn't accidental minimalism, it was a deliberate decision to remove the safety net and leave the audience fully exposed to the material. Pauses were treated as active elements rather than transitions. The spaces between lines carry their own pressure, building expectation and providing just enough room for what was just said to register before the next exchange arrives. When Jessup and Kaffee face each other in those final scenes, the silence around their words magnifies rather than diminishes them. Every statement lands in empty space, which means it lands without anything softening the impact. The technique respects both the material and the people watching it. Music tells an audience what to feel, which is useful when the material needs support, and counterproductive when it doesn't. In these scenes, the performances and the words are the argument, and adding orchestral direction would have meant competing with something that didn't need the help. Silence here is not the absence of sound. It is a choice about where the power in a scene actually lives. Number 20. The title almost meant something else. The film went through alternate titles during development, and the alternatives pointed the story in meaningfully different directions. Some of the options being considered emphasized military honor and the concept of duty rather than the individuals caught within the system. The framing a title provides shapes expectation before any image appears on screen, and titles focused on duty would have positioned audiences to receive the material through a very different emotional and thematic lens. A title emphasizing duty suggests a story about service and sacrifice, about the value of institutional commitment and the weight of military obligation. Audiences primed by that framing would arrive inclined to sympathize with military culture rather than interrogate it. The frame the title creates isn't neutral, and the alternatives under consideration would have set up a film that felt like a different thing before it began. A Few Good Men shifted the orientation toward the human beings inside the system rather than the system itself. The emphasis on individual men, on people rather than codes or institutions, signals that this story's concern is with how specific human beings navigate structures that complicate the goodness they're asked to embody. That emphasis carries through the entire film and defines what lingers after it ends. The choice of title was, quietly, also a choice about what the film was going to be. Number 21. The film is remembered incorrectly. The film's cultural legacy is built on a misreading. It is famous for one moment, remembered for one line, associated in the broader culture with a single peak of righteous confrontation. But that moment represents exactly what the film is warning against: the seductive comfort of believing you have already arrived at the truth, that certainty is a position of strength rather than a form of blindness. The shout the film is remembered for is the thing the film is skeptical of. The actual argument is quieter, more uncomfortable, and considerably less suitable for a merchandise license. The film isn't celebrating the exposure of a villain and the restoration of justice. It is asking what we are willing to demand from the people who protect us, what we are willing to overlook in order to feel safe, and whether the systems we depend on are capable of the accountability we want to believe they have. Those questions don't reduce to a catchphrase. Remembering the film correctly requires staying with the discomfort rather than escaping into its most theatrical moment. The irony at the center of its legacy is that the thing that made it famous, the line, the scene, the shout, became the mechanism by which its actual meaning was obscured. The truth the film is offering can't be handled in a soundbite. It requires the full 90 minutes to build, and it lives in what surrounds the famous moment rather than in the moment itself. A Few Good Men endures not because it shouts its argument, but because it forces viewers to sit with moral discomfort that survives the closing credits. The film came closer to being something safer and simpler than most people realize. The courtroom climax nearly disappeared. The ending nearly stayed unresolved. The dialogue-heavy approach was treated as a commercial liability, right up until the moment it became the reason anyone remembered the film at all. Every risk the filmmakers held onto shaped the movie that exists. But what makes it last isn't the famous line or the explosive confession, it's the questions buried underneath those moments, about authority and obedience and what we are willing to ignore in exchange for feeling protected. Those questions didn't resolve in 1992. They haven't resolved since. If these secrets changed how you see the film, like and subscribe for more movie secrets hidden in plain sight. Which scene in A Few Good Men feels different to you now after hearing these secrets? Let us know in the comments.